My husband Mark used to make tea for me every night before bed. Chamomile with honey, just the way I liked it. For years, I believed that small routine was love. I believed it was the quiet kind of care people build into a marriage after the excitement fades and life settles into something calmer. But the night everything changed, I noticed something in Mark's eyes that I had never seen before. It was a small thing, just a flicker, the kind of expression you might miss if you weren't looking closely. He handed me the cup, watched the steam rise, and smiled in that same careful way he always did. "Drink up," he said softly. "You've been exhausted lately." I lifted the cup toward my lips, and for a moment I thought about how normal the scene looked. A husband taking care of his wife after a long day. Anyone watching would have seen kindness. But 3 months earlier, I had found something hidden in the lining of Mark's gym bag. And since that moment, I had begun to understand something very frightening about the man I married. Sometimes the person offering comfort is the same person quietly taking everything away from you. Before we go further, before I explain what I found and why that cup of tea changed my life, I want to ask you something. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. I always read the comments because when I first began telling this story, I realized something important. I wasn't the only person who had lived through something like this. The warning signs are often small at first. So small you question whether they even exist. That is exactly how it began for me. It started with exhaustion. I began waking up late in the morning with a headache that felt like pressure behind my eyes. At first, I blamed stress. My father had died suddenly just 4 months earlier, and the grief had been heavier than I expected. My father was the kind of man who solved problems quietly. He built businesses, invested in properties, and handled complicated situations without ever raising his voice. When he died, the responsibility for everything he built passed to me. I assumed the headaches were simply my body reacting to grief and paperwork and endless legal meetings. Mark seemed worried about me, which at the time felt comforting. He would bring coffee to the bedside and brush my hair away from my face while asking how I slept. "You didn't move all night," he would say. "You were out like a light." I believed him. I believed everything he said because when someone has been your partner for years, you don't question the small things. You assume the foundation of your life is solid. That assumption was my first mistake. The second sign appeared about 2 weeks later. I opened my jewelry box one afternoon and noticed my diamond earrings were gone. They had been a gift from my father when I finished college. I kept them in the same velvet compartment for years. I searched the bedroom, the bathroom, the hallway drawers. I even checked the kitchen counter, convinced I had absent-mindedly removed them while cooking. When Mark came home that evening, I mentioned it casually, expecting him to help me look. Instead, he wrapped his arms around my shoulders and sighed gently. "Claire, you've been so overwhelmed lately," he said. "Maybe you put them somewhere safe and forgot." The word forgot stayed with me. It was the first time Mark suggested my memory might be slipping. At the time, it sounded reasonable. People misplace things all the time, especially when they are grieving. But 2 days later, my father's vintage watch disappeared from the dresser. A week after that, a small gold bracelet my mother had worn for years vanished as well. Each time, Mark had the same explanation: stress, exhaustion, forgetfulness. At some point, I began to feel embarrassed about it. Losing sentimental items made me feel careless, and I started writing things down in a small notebook so I could track where I placed everything. That notebook eventually became the most important thing in my house because it showed me something I could not ignore. According to my own notes, I wasn't forgetting things at all. The objects were disappearing while I slept. That realization was the first moment I felt genuine fear. I remember sitting at the kitchen table late one evening, staring at that notebook and wondering how something could vanish from a locked bedroom while both of us were in the house. For a brief moment, I even considered the possibility of a break-in, but nothing else was disturbed. No doors forced open, no alarms triggered, just personal items gone. Looking back now, that was the moment I should have trusted my instincts. Something was wrong in my house, and I was the only person who seemed to notice. The discovery that changed everything happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Mark had gone to the gym after work, leaving his duffel bag by the front door. I wasn't searching through his belongings at the time. I was looking for my spare house key, which I believed I had dropped earlier that morning. I opened the gym bag thinking it might have slipped inside when I carried groceries from the car. As I moved a pair of running shoes, my fingers brushed against something hard beneath the lining of the bag. At first, I thought it was part of the bag's structure, but when I pressed on it again, the fabric shifted slightly. Someone had stitched a small pocket into the lining. My heart began to beat faster as I pulled the fabric apart just enough to see inside. A small blue glass vial rolled into my hand. The liquid inside moved slowly when I tilted it, thick and dark like syrup. There was no label, no instructions, nothing that explained why it existed. The question that echoed in my mind was simple and terrifying. Why hide something like this in a gym bag? That night, I barely slept. I kept turning the vial over in my hands, trying to convince myself it belonged to something harmless. Supplements, vitamins, anything ordinary. But the secrecy around it made that explanation impossible to believe. The next morning, I drove across town to a private laboratory and asked them to analyze the contents. When the results came back 2 days later, the words on the report made my stomach drop. The liquid was a concentrated sedative typically used in controlled psychiatric treatment. In small doses, it could produce deep sleep and memory impairment. In repeated doses over time, it could create confusion, fatigue, and cognitive decline. I sat in my car reading that report over and over again until the meaning became unavoidable. Someone had been giving me that drug repeatedly, and the only person in my house every night when I drank tea was Mark. That was the moment my entire marriage changed in my mind. Because suddenly every cup of tea, every morning headache, every missing item began to form a pattern. At that point, I still believed my husband was worried about me. I had no idea he was building a legal case against me. That realization came later, but the seeds of it began forming that very evening. Mark came home from work smiling, carrying a bag of groceries. He greeted me with the same warmth he always had and began preparing tea in the kitchen while asking about my day. Watching him move around the room felt surreal because I was seeing him differently now. The man I trusted most in the world had hidden a drug in his gym bag, and I had proof of what that drug could do. When he handed me the cup that night, I smiled back at him and raised it toward my lips. But instead of drinking, I waited until he turned his back and quietly poured the tea into the sink. That simple act marked the beginning of the most difficult performance of my life. From that moment forward, I decided I would pretend the drug was working. I would pretend to be exactly the confused, exhausted wife Mark seemed to believe I was becoming. And while he thought I was slipping further into confusion, I would quietly watch everything he did. Over the next week, I learned something chilling about Mark. He watched me constantly after I drank tea. He paid attention to how slowly I moved, how often I asked questions, whether I appeared tired or alert. Once I noticed the pattern, it became impossible to ignore. The tea wasn't just a routine, it was part of an experiment. I tested my theory one night by switching our cups while he stepped into the hallway to answer a phone call. When he returned, he picked up the cup meant for me without noticing the difference. We sat together watching television while the clock moved slowly across the wall. 20 minutes later, Mark began rubbing his eyes. 30 minutes later, his speech slowed slightly. Within 40 minutes, he was asleep on the couch. Watching him drift into that deep, unnatural sleep made something inside me turn cold, because now I knew exactly what had been happening to me night after night. But the bigger question still remained. Why would my husband want me confused and forgetful in the first place? The answer to that question would arrive sooner than I expected, and when it did, it revealed a betrayal far deeper than anything I had imagined. For the next few days, I continued the performance. I moved slower than usual around the house, pretended to forget small details, and occasionally asked Mark the same question twice just to see how he reacted. What surprised me most was how quickly he adjusted to the idea that I was becoming unreliable. At first, he acted concerned, but after several days, that concern began to change into something else. He started finishing my sentences when I spoke, to correcting me when I remembered things clearly, and reminding me about conversations that had never happened. Watching him do this felt like standing inside a carefully designed illusion. If someone had entered the room at that moment, they would have believed I was confused, and Mark was patiently helping me through it. The truth was the opposite. I was watching every move he made while pretending not to understand what was happening. That was when I realized something important. The drug was only part of the plan. The rest depended on convincing everyone around us that I was losing my mind. About a week after I found the vial, I saw the next piece of that plan by accident. Mark was in the shower and his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Normally, I never touched his phone. But by that point, nothing about our life felt normal anymore. The screen lit up with a message preview that said, "Did she sign the paperwork yet?" My chest tightened immediately. I picked up the phone and saw the message came from someone saved under the initials KV. My mind began racing as I opened the conversation. The most recent message was the one I had already seen, but the one above it made my stomach drop. Mark had replied earlier that morning. "Not yet. The fog is getting worse, though." The fog. That was the exact word he had used to describe my memory problems the night before. I scrolled further up through the conversation and felt a chill move down my spine. They were discussing my behavior as if I wasn't even a person. There were messages about my confusion, my supposed memory lapses, and whether a doctor would believe the story Mark was building. Then I saw a word that explained everything: power of attorney. I remember standing there in the kitchen staring at the phone while my heart pounded so loudly it felt like it might echo through the room. If Mark convinced a doctor that I was mentally incompetent, he could gain legal authority over my finances. That meant control over everything my father had left behind: the businesses, the properties, the trust funds. All of it could pass into Mark's hands with a single legal document if a doctor declared me incapable of managing my own affairs. The terrifying part wasn't just the plan itself. It was how carefully it had been prepared. The messages showed Mark discussing specific symptoms, asking how to make my behavior look convincing, even talking about recording certain moments so a specialist could review them later. At that point, I still believed the person helping him was some kind of lawyer or financial advisor. I hadn't yet realized the truth would be much worse. I placed the phone back on the counter exactly where I found it and walked slowly to the bedroom. For the first time since discovering the vial, I understood the scale of what was happening. Someone wasn't just drugging me. Someone was building a story about my mental decline. That was when I noticed the camera. I was brushing my hair in front of the mirror that evening when I saw a small reflection near the ceiling. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but when I moved slightly, the reflection appeared again. A faint purple glow coming from the smoke detector above our bed. My pulse quickened as I lifted my phone and opened the camera app. There's a trick investigators sometimes use when searching for hidden lenses. Infrared lights can show up through a phone camera even when they're invisible to the naked eye. I slowly pointed my phone toward the ceiling and looked at the screen. There it was. A tiny blinking dot inside the smoke detector. A hidden camera aimed directly at the bed. For several seconds, I just stood there staring at it, trying to process what it meant. Mark hadn't just been drugging me. He had been filming me while I was confused, exhausted, and disoriented. Those recordings would be perfect evidence for a doctor evaluating my mental health. The realization made my stomach twist. Everything I had done while under the influence of that sedative had been captured on video. Finding the hidden camera was horrifying, but the worst betrayal in that house wasn't my husband. I didn't understand that yet, but I was about to. My first instinct was to remove the camera immediately. I even pulled a chair over so I could reach the smoke detector. But then I stopped myself. If Mark came home and noticed the camera was gone, he would know I had discovered the truth. The entire plan would change overnight. Instead, I stepped down from the chair and left the camera exactly where it was. If Mark wanted to film my supposed decline, I decided I would give him the most convincing performance he had ever seen. Over the next several days, I played the role carefully. I stumbled slightly while walking down the hallway, asked Mark to remind me about appointments I had never forgotten, and occasionally looked around the room as if I couldn't remember why I had entered it. Each time I did something like that, I could see Mark studying me with growing satisfaction. The more convincing my performance became, the more confident he appeared. That confidence would eventually become his biggest mistake. 2 days later, someone knocked on the front door while Mark was still at work. When I opened it, I felt my breath catch in my throat. Standing on the porch was Karen. She had been my closest friend for almost 20 years. Karen was the person who helped me choose my wedding dress. She was the one who sat beside me during my father's funeral, holding my hand while I cried. Seeing her there that afternoon should have felt comforting, but something about her expression made me uneasy immediately. She smiled warmly and stepped inside, carrying a small container of homemade lasagna. "I thought you might need a real meal," she said. "Mark told me you've been having a hard time lately." My chest tightened at the way she said Mark told me. We sat together at the kitchen table while she asked gentle questions about how I had been feeling. At first, the conversation sounded like concern, but as she continued speaking, I realized every question was leading in the same direction. She kept bringing up my memory, my fatigue, my confusion. Finally, she leaned across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're lucky to have Mark," she said softly. "He's been so worried about you." In that moment, something inside me shifted. The way she spoke about Mark didn't feel like a friend repeating secondhand information. It felt rehearsed, like someone repeating a story they had practiced many times before. I watched her carefully as she continued talking about a specialist Mark had mentioned. A doctor who could evaluate cognitive decline. A doctor who might recommend temporary guardianship if my condition worsened. The more she spoke, the clearer the truth became. Karen wasn't just repeating Mark's concerns. She was reinforcing them. She was helping him shape the story about my supposed mental deterioration. That realization hit me harder than anything I had discovered so far. I thought I had one enemy in my house, but I was wrong. The person helping him destroy my life was someone I had trusted completely for 2 decades. After Karen left that afternoon, I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the empty chair across the table. Betrayal from a spouse is devastating, but betrayal from your closest friend cuts much deeper. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. If Mark and Karen were working together, I couldn't fight them alone. I needed someone who would believe me and help me uncover the full extent of what they were doing. The person who came to mind was someone my father had introduced me to years earlier. His name was Daniel Reyes, a retired detective who specialized in financial investigations. My father trusted him completely, which meant something. The next morning, I drove across town to Daniel's office and told him everything. The tea, the vial, the messages, the camera, Karen's visit. Daniel listened quietly without interrupting. When I finished speaking, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a long moment before asking a single question. "Do you trust your instincts?" I answered immediately. "Yes." Daniel nodded slowly and said something that stayed with me long after that conversation ended. "When someone starts doubting their own sanity," he said, "it usually means someone else has been lying to them." Hearing those words felt like the first moment of clarity I had experienced in weeks. For the first time since discovering the vial, someone believed me. Daniel spent the next hour explaining what he thought was happening. According to him, the combination of sedatives, staged confusion, and hidden cameras was a classic method used in high-value inheritance cases. If Mark gathered enough evidence showing my supposed decline, a cooperative doctor could legally declare me incapable of managing my estate. Once that happened, Mark would gain temporary authority over everything my father left behind. The process could move very quickly once a medical report supported it. Listening to Daniel explain the plan in such clear terms made my stomach turn. What frightened me most wasn't the possibility that Mark might succeed. It was how carefully he had arranged everything. The drug created the symptoms. The camera documented them. Karen reinforced the narrative with concerned conversations. All that remained was the doctor's signature. At that point, Daniel asked me something unexpected. "Does Mark have a second phone?" I frowned and told him I had never seen one. Daniel nodded thoughtfully and said something that made my pulse quicken. "Men running complicated operations usually do," he said. "And if we find it, we might find the proof you need." I left Daniel's office that afternoon with a strange mixture of fear and determination. For the first time since this nightmare began, I understood the shape of the trap Mark and Karen had built around me. But understanding something and escaping it are two very different things. Daniel had given me a small device before I left. It was about the size of a deck of cards, with a simple cable attached to one side. If you find the second phone, he told me, plug this into it for 5 minutes. That's all I need. I turned the device over in my hand, wondering how something so small could reveal something so large. Daniel explained that the device could copy messages, call logs, and photographs without altering anything on the phone itself. If Mark and Karen had been planning this for months, the evidence would be there. The idea of finding that proof made my heart race, but it also meant something else. If Mark caught me doing it, the performance would be over. That night, I continued playing the role Mark expected. I moved slowly through the house, asked him to repeat things he had just said, and occasionally stared into space as if I had forgotten what I was doing. Mark responded exactly as Daniel predicted. His voice was gentle, his movements patient, but behind the concern I could see something else growing stronger every day. Confidence. The more convincing my confusion appeared, the more certain he seemed that his plan was working. At dinner, he reminded me to finish my tea, watching carefully while I pretended to drink it. Later that evening, he suggested we watch a movie, but I deliberately lost track of the plot halfway through and asked him to explain what was happening. Each moment like that strengthened the illusion he was building about my mental state. Mark believed he was guiding me gently through my decline, never realizing that every gesture was helping me understand exactly how his plan worked. 2 nights later, the opportunity Daniel had predicted finally appeared. Mark went to the gym after dinner, leaving his office upstairs exactly as he always did. I waited 20 minutes after his car left the driveway before walking quietly up the staircase. The hallway felt strangely quiet that evening, as if the house itself was waiting to see what I would do next. Mark's office door was slightly open, and the faint glow of his desk lamp illuminated the bookshelf along the far wall. My eyes moved immediately to the same book I had noticed earlier in the week. The Wealth of Nations. Mark had always joked that it was his favorite book, though I had never once seen him actually read it. I stepped closer and pulled it halfway from the shelf. The center of the pages had been cut out carefully, creating a hollow compartment. Inside that compartment sat a black smartphone. For a moment, I just stood there staring at it, feeling the weight of everything that discovery meant. Daniel had been right. My hands trembled slightly as I plugged the cloning device into the phone. A small blue light began blinking on the device, indicating that the transfer had started. The progress bar on the screen moved slowly, each percentage feeling like an hour. I stood beside Mark's desk, listening to every sound in the house, terrified that his car might suddenly pull back into the driveway. At 20%, my heart began pounding harder. At 40%, I checked the hallway again to make sure I was still alone. By 60%, I realized how dangerous this moment truly was. If Mark walked through the door and saw me standing there with his hidden phone, everything would collapse instantly. But leaving before the transfer finished would mean losing the evidence Daniel needed. I forced myself to stay where I was, watching the progress bar inch forward while the silence around me grew heavier with every passing second. At 80%, my own phone vibrated in my pocket. I nearly jumped at the sudden sound before realizing it was a message from Daniel. I opened it quickly, keeping one eye on the hallway. "I'm receiving data," the message read. A second message arrived seconds later. "Claire, you're going to want to sit down." My stomach tightened as I read those words. The cloning device reached 95% just as another message appeared. "Your husband isn't working alone." I felt a cold wave move through my chest as I read the screenshot Daniel had attached. It was a message conversation between Mark and someone saved under the initials KV, the same initials I had seen earlier on Mark's phone, Karen Vance, my best friend. My breath caught as I read the most recent exchange. Karen had asked a simple question. "Is she under tonight?" Mark had responded immediately. "Yes, she drank everything." Seeing those words written so casually made my hands shake. I scrolled through the conversation while the cloning device finished its work. The messages stretched back for months, detailing every step of the plan Mark and Karen had built together. They discussed my father's estate, the value of specific properties, and the legal steps required to gain control of everything once I was declared incompetent. Karen had even suggested increasing the dosage of the sedative if my behavior didn't appear convincing enough on camera. Reading those messages felt like watching two strangers discuss a business deal, except the business they were negotiating was my life. One message in particular made my stomach drop. Karen wrote, "Once the doctor signs off, we can list the lake house immediately." The lake house had been my father's favorite place in the world. He built it himself decades earlier and spent every summer there fishing at sunrise. Seeing Karen treat it like a piece of inventory made the betrayal feel almost unbearable. I thought I had one enemy in my house, but I was wrong. The person who had helped me pick out my wedding flowers was the same person helping Mark plan my legal disappearance. That realization hit harder than anything I had discovered so far. As I continued reading the messages, the scale of their plan became clearer. Karen had already opened offshore accounts in preparation for transferring my father's assets. Mark had begun selling smaller valuables from the house while I was asleep under the influence of the sedative. Even the specialist Mark planned to introduce me to had been discussed in detail. According to their messages, the doctor had assisted in similar cases before, declaring patients mentally unfit after reviewing carefully selected evidence. Everything about the operation was organized with chilling precision. Mark and Karen had not just been plotting for weeks. They had been preparing for months. Daniel sent another message while I was still reading. "Check the photo folder." I opened it and immediately felt my chest tighten. The folder contained dozens of images of me taken inside my own home. Some showed me asleep in bed. Others captured moments when I appeared confused or unsteady on my feet. Every photograph had been taken from hidden angles, confirming what I had suspected about the camera in the smoke detector. Mark had been documenting my supposed decline carefully, collecting images that would make me appear unstable to anyone reviewing them later. Seeing myself through that lens made me feel strangely disconnected from my own life. I looked like someone slowly losing control of her mind, exactly the image Mark and Karen wanted the world to see. Daniel sent one final message before the cloning device completed its transfer. "Claire, this is enough evidence to stop them, but we have to move carefully." Just as I unplugged the cloning device and returned the phone to its hiding place, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint creak from the hallway floor. Someone was coming upstairs. I slid the book back into place on the shelf and stepped away from the desk just as the office door began to open. Mark stood there in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he looked at me standing in the middle of his office. For a moment, neither of us spoke. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Finally, he tilted his head slightly and asked the question I had been dreading all evening. "Claire," he said quietly, "what are you doing in here?" For a moment, my mind went completely blank. I had rehearsed many possibilities for how that night might unfold, but none of them involved Mark standing in the doorway staring directly at me while his hidden phone sat only a few feet away on the bookshelf. I forced myself to breathe slowly and looked down at the folder I had grabbed from his desk moments earlier. "I couldn't sleep," I said softly. "I thought maybe the warranty papers for the washing machine were in here somewhere." Mark didn't respond right away. He leaned against the doorframe and studied me carefully, the way someone studies a puzzle they are trying to solve. Then he stepped into the room and placed his hands gently on my shoulders. "Claire," he said, "you should be resting. You've been confused all week." I lowered my eyes and nodded, letting my voice sound uncertain. "I know," I whispered. "I just keep forgetting things lately." Something changed in Mark's expression when I said that. The suspicion in his eyes faded, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. He believed the act. He guided me out of the office and down the hallway as if I were fragile, his hand resting lightly on my back. Watching him play the role of the caring husband would have been convincing to anyone else. But now I understood every detail of what he was doing. He needed the story of my confusion to remain believable. That meant protecting the illusion even when something unexpected happened. When we reached the bedroom, he tucked the blankets around me and kissed my forehead before turning off the light. "Get some sleep," he said gently. "Tomorrow we'll talk about seeing a specialist." The door closed quietly behind him, and I lay there staring at the ceiling for several minutes, listening to his footsteps move down the hallway. Only after I heard the living room television turn on did I allow myself to move again. My phone buzzed softly under the pillow. Daniel had already sent several new messages. "I've reviewed the data," the first message said. "Claire, the situation is worse than we thought." The next message arrived before I could reply. "The doctor Mark plans to use has a history." I sat up slowly and typed back a single question. "What kind of history?" Daniel's response took a few seconds, but when it arrived, it made my stomach tighten. "He's been involved in multiple guardianship cases where wealthy patients were declared mentally unfit. In every case, control of their assets passed to family members within weeks." I stared at the screen while a cold feeling spread through my chest. If Daniel was right, Mark and Karen weren't just improvising a plan. They were working with someone who had done this before. Daniel sent one more message that night. "Claire, if they move forward with the evaluation, you could lose control of everything very quickly. We need more proof before that happens." I placed the phone back under the pillow and lay down again, but sleep never came. I kept replaying Mark's words in my mind. "Tomorrow we'll talk about seeing a specialist." The next morning, Mark seemed unusually cheerful. He made pancakes, poured coffee, and turned on music in the kitchen while moving around the stove. If I hadn't known what he was planning, the scene would have looked completely normal. At one point, he set a plate in front of me and smiled in that calm, reassuring way he had perfected over the past few weeks. "I made an appointment for you," he said casually. My stomach tightened. "An appointment?" I asked. Mark nodded. "With a specialist who deals with memory issues, just to be safe." I forced a confused expression, letting my brow wrinkle slightly as if I didn't quite understand. "A doctor?" I asked. "Yes," he replied gently. "Someone who can evaluate what's been happening lately." I knew immediately that this was the doctor Daniel had warned me about. The final step of the plan was moving forward exactly as they intended. I looked down at my plate and asked the question Mark was expecting. "When is the appointment?" "Tuesday morning," he said. 4 days away. That was the amount of time I had left before a doctor could officially declare me incapable of managing my own life. Mark continued speaking as if the situation were completely ordinary, explaining how the evaluation would help us understand why I had been feeling so forgetful. I nodded slowly while pretending to process his words. But inside my mind, something else was happening. Daniel had told me we needed more proof, and now I understood why. Messages between Mark and Karen were not enough on their own. We needed something undeniable, something that showed exactly what they planned to do. As Mark carried the empty plates to the sink, I realized the next few days would determine everything. If I made one mistake, Mark's story about my mental decline would become reality. But if I stayed patient and careful, the truth might finally have a chance to surface. Later that afternoon, Daniel called me directly instead of sending a message. His voice sounded serious the moment I answered. "I've been analyzing the financial records from Mark's phone," he said, "and there's something you need to know." I sat down at the kitchen table and waited. "Money has been moving out of your accounts for weeks," Daniel continued. "Small transfers, always under the amount that would trigger automatic alerts." My chest tightened as I listened. "Where is it going?" I asked quietly. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Accounts opened under Karen's name," Daniel said. Hearing that felt like being punched in the chest. Karen wasn't just helping Mark build the legal case against me. She was already moving money out of my estate. Daniel continued explaining what he had discovered. "There's also a property listing connected to those transfers," he said. "Your father's lake house." The words made my heart drop. The lake house had been my father's sanctuary. He built it himself decades earlier and filled it with memories of fishing trips, summer barbecues, and quiet evenings by the water. Selling it was something I had never even considered. Are you sure? I asked Daniel. Yes, he replied. The listing paperwork names Mark as the acting manager of the estate. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table. But I never signed anything giving him that authority, I said. Daniel sighed softly. He may have filed for temporary oversight already, he explained. If the specialist signs off on your evaluation Tuesday, that temporary authority could become permanent. The room felt smaller as I absorbed what he was saying. Mark and Karen were already positioning themselves to take everything the moment the doctor declared me incompetent. The plan was moving forward exactly as they intended. That evening, I walked slowly through the house, studying every corner the way someone studies a map before entering dangerous territory. The more I looked, the more evidence of Mark's careful preparation I began to notice. The smoke detector in the bedroom wasn't the only place a hidden camera could be concealed. In the living room, I found a digital photo frame displaying pictures from our wedding and vacations. When I leaned closer, I noticed the tiny lens embedded in the corner of the frame. Another camera. Mark had been recording me in multiple rooms, collecting footage that would reinforce his story about my mental decline. Standing there in the quiet living room, I finally understood how much effort had gone into building this illusion. The entire house had become a stage, and every moment of my supposed confusion had been carefully documented. Mark wasn't just telling people I was losing my memory. He was creating visual proof to make sure they believed it. That night, I called Daniel again. We can't wait until Tuesday, I said the moment he answered. Mark has already started moving money and listing properties. Daniel listened quietly while I explained what I had discovered about the cameras and the property listing. When I finished speaking, he remained silent for several seconds before responding. Then we give them exactly what they want, he said finally. I frowned slightly, unsure what he meant. What do you mean? I asked. Mark and Karen want evidence that you're unstable, Daniel explained. So we give them the biggest episode they've ever seen. My pulse quickened as I began to understand what he was suggesting. If Mark believed my condition had reached a crisis point, he might accelerate the plan before Tuesday's appointment. That could force him to reveal more about what he intended to do. But if we do that, I said slowly, things could move very quickly. Daniel's answer was calm and certain. Exactly, he said. And when they do, we'll be ready. The next 2 days became the most exhausting performance of my life. Daniel had warned me that if Mark believed my condition was deteriorating rapidly, he might rush the final steps of his plan. That meant I had to make my behavior convincing enough to alarm him without appearing completely incapable. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant attention. I began forgetting small conversations intentionally, in repeating the same questions several times during dinner and occasionally standing in the hallway as if I couldn't remember where I was going. Mark watched everything carefully. At first, his concern appeared genuine, but by the second day, I began to see something else in his expression. A quiet satisfaction that he tried very hard to hide. Each time I stumbled or appeared confused, his eyes would linger on me for a moment longer than usual. It was the look of someone watching a plan unfold exactly as they expected. Sunday evening provided the moment Daniel had predicted. Mark came home from the grocery store carrying a small bag and placed it on the kitchen counter before turning toward me with that same gentle smile he had used for weeks. How are you feeling tonight? He asked. I looked around the room slowly as if I needed time to understand the question. A little tired, I said softly. Mark nodded and began preparing tea, humming quietly while the kettle heated. I leaned against the counter pretending to steady myself, and he immediately stepped closer as if worried I might fall. Maybe you should rest after you drink this, he said, sliding the cup across the counter. You've had a rough weekend. I raised the cup toward my lips and nodded faintly while pretending to take a sip. Mark watched closely, just as he always did. That small moment told me everything I needed to know. He was waiting for the sedative to take effect again. About 30 minutes later, I sat on the couch staring at the television screen while Mark pretended to read a magazine beside me. I allowed my head to tilt slightly as if the room were spinning. "Mark?" I said quietly. "Did we talk about seeing a doctor tomorrow?" He lowered the magazine and looked at me carefully. "No," he replied. "That appointment is Tuesday, remember?" I frowned as if the information confused me. "Tuesday," I repeated. "Right." Mark studied me for another moment before setting the magazine aside. "Maybe we shouldn't wait," he said thoughtfully. "If you're feeling worse, I could call the doctor tonight." My heart began beating faster as I heard those words. Daniel had predicted this possibility exactly. If Mark believed my condition had deteriorated quickly, he might decide the specialist needed to intervene immediately. That would force him to reveal how far he was willing to go to secure control of my estate. I nodded slowly and leaned back against the couch as if exhausted. Later that night, Mark helped me upstairs and tucked the blankets around me with the same careful tenderness he had practiced for weeks. "Try to sleep," he said softly. "Everything will make more sense in the morning." I watched him leave the room and close the door quietly behind him. For several minutes, I remained perfectly still, listening to the faint sounds of the house settling into silence. Then my phone vibrated under the pillow. Daniel had sent a message that made my pulse spike instantly. "Claire, something just changed." I sat up slowly and typed back a question. "What happened?" The response appeared almost immediately. "Mark contacted the doctor tonight. He ordered additional sedatives." My stomach tightened as I read the message. "Why?" I typed. Daniel's next reply arrived seconds later. "Because they're moving faster than planned." A second message appeared before I could respond. "Claire, I think they're going to act tonight." The house felt unusually quiet as midnight passed. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the dark hallway outside the door while Daniel's warning repeated in my mind. If Mark and the doctor were moving tonight, that meant they were skipping the official evaluation entirely. Whatever they planned to do would happen quickly and without witnesses. The clock beside the bed read 1:42 a.m. when I heard the first sound. The garage door opening. My chest tightened immediately. Mark had gone downstairs earlier saying he needed water, but the sound of the garage meant someone else had just arrived. I moved quietly to the bedroom door and opened it just enough to see the staircase. Voices drifted upward from the living room below. Mark's voice was calm and controlled as always. The second voice belonged to a man I had never met, but I already knew who he was. The Dr. Daniel had warned me about. I stepped back into the bedroom and climbed into bed just as the footsteps began moving toward the stairs. My heart pounded while I slowed my breathing and closed my eyes, pretending to be deeply asleep. The bedroom door opened a moment later and soft light spilled across the floor. I heard the faint sound of a medical bag being placed on the nightstand. Mark's voice broke the silence. "She's been getting worse," he said quietly. The doctor responded in a calm, clinical tone. "Then we shouldn't wait any longer." My pulse thundered in my ears as I listened to them discuss my condition like a medical case. Mark explained how confused I had been all weekend, describing the behavior I had staged for him exactly as Daniel predicted. The doctor listened carefully before opening the medical bag. "We'll give her something stronger tonight," he said. My entire body went cold as I heard the faint click of a syringe being prepared. The mattress dipped slightly as Mark sat beside me. His hand brushed a strand of hair away from my face in the same gentle gesture he had used countless times before. "It's okay," he whispered softly. "This will help you rest." I felt the cold tip of the needle touch my arm. For a split second, fear threatened to overwhelm me completely. If they injected me now, I would lose control of everything. The sedative would make it impossible to resist or explain what was happening. Daniel had warned me that the moment they tried something like this, I needed to act immediately. So I did the only thing I could think of. I jerked upright suddenly, knocking the doctor's hand aside and sending the syringe skittering across the hardwood floor. Mark jumped back in shock while I stared around the room, pretending to be disoriented. "What's happening?" I gasped. Why are you here? The doctor froze beside the bed, clearly surprised by the sudden movement. Mark recovered first, stepping closer with his usual calm expression returning quickly. Claire, it's okay, he said gently. You were having another episode. I blinked slowly as if trying to understand his words. Episode? I repeated weakly. Mark nodded toward the doctor. I called him because you've been so confused tonight. The doctor picked up the syringe carefully and placed it back in the medical bag while studying me with cold, analytical eyes. We were just going to help you sleep, he said calmly. I lowered my head slightly, pretending exhaustion while my mind raced. Every word they spoke was being recorded through my phone under the pillow. Daniel had insisted on keeping the connection active in case Mark tried something like this. The evidence was building exactly as we hoped. Just then, Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and frowned before stepping into the hallway to answer the call. The doctor remained in the bedroom watching me carefully. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he sighed and adjusted his glasses. You must feel very confused lately, he said. His voice carried no warmth, only professional curiosity. I nodded slowly while staring at the floor. Mark's voice drifted faintly through the open doorway. Yes, she woke up, he said quietly. Not yet. A pause followed before he spoke again. Fine, I'll handle it. My stomach tightened as I listened to those words. When Mark returned to the room, his expression had changed completely. The gentle concern was gone, replaced by something colder and more impatient. We're moving her downstairs, he said to the doctor. The doctor raised an eyebrow slightly. Why? Mark's answer sent a chill through my entire body. Because the gas will spread faster there. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. Gas. The word echoed in my mind while I sat there pretending to be weak and disoriented. Then the smell reached me. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Natural gas. My heart began pounding harder as the reality of what Mark had just said settled over me. They weren't just planning to sedate me. They were planning something that would leave no questions afterward. An accident. A confused woman who forgot to turn something off in the middle of the night. A tragic fire that destroyed the house and the evidence inside it. The doctor nodded slowly as if Mark's suggestion made perfect sense. That could work, he said. Mark stepped closer and reached for my arm. Come on, Claire, he said quietly. Let's get you somewhere more comfortable. I allowed my body to go limp as he pulled me gently to my feet. If they believed I was too weak to resist, they would keep talking. The hallway felt colder than usual as Mark guided me toward the staircase. The doctor followed behind us, carrying the medical bag that held the syringe. Each step down the stairs brought the smell of gas stronger into the air. My mind raced while I tried to remain calm. Daniel had been listening through my phone the entire time. Every word Mark and the doctor had spoken was now recorded. The question that haunted me was whether the police would arrive before Mark finished what he started. Halfway down the stairs, Mark paused and looked back at the doctor. Did you loosen the line already? He asked. The doctor nodded calmly. The water heater connection, he replied. If the pilot light ignites while the gas is building, the rest will take care of itself. The casual way they discussed my death felt surreal. Mark even sighed softly, as if the situation were unfortunate rather than deliberate. After her father died, she just couldn't handle the pressure. Mark said quietly, It's tragic. The doctor shrugged slightly. These things happen, he replied. Hearing them speak about my life like a story they were rehearsing made something inside me turn completely cold. I realized in that moment that Mark had already written the explanation for what would happen next. I would become a grieving widow who lost her mental stability and accidentally destroyed her own home. No one would question it because the cameras in the house had already captured weeks of footage showing my supposed decline. They had planned every detail carefully. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, Mark guided me toward a chair near the old furnace. Sit here, he said gently. I lowered myself slowly while the doctor opened his bag again and removed the syringe. Even with the gas spreading through the basement, they still wanted to sedate me first. Mark leaned close and whispered something that confirmed exactly how much resentment he had been hiding all along. "You should have just cooperated," he said quietly. "You made this harder than it needed to be." I lifted my head slowly and looked at him. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel afraid. Because Mark still didn't know something important. The phone under my pillow upstairs had been transmitting everything to Daniel the moment he walked into the bedroom. Mark believed he had complete control of the situation, but the evidence of his plan was already moving far beyond the walls of the house. The doctor stepped forward and reached for my arm again with the syringe. "This will only take a moment," he said calmly. My pulse thundered in my ears as I watched him prepare the injection. Somewhere above us, the house creaked softly, followed by the faint clicking sound of the water heater attempting to ignite. The doctor paused and looked toward the heater with a slight frown. "That shouldn't ignite yet," he muttered. Mark glanced at the unit impatiently. "What do you mean?" he asked. The doctor shook his head slightly. "Gas usually takes time to build before the flame catches." Another clicking sound echoed through the basement, followed by the faint hiss of gas moving through the loosened pipe. Mark turned back toward me, his expression tightening with frustration. "Do it," he said sharply. The doctor knelt beside me and raised the syringe again. My entire body tensed as the needle moved closer to my arm. Then, before it could touch my skin, a deafening crash echoed through the house. The basement door burst open and bright flashlights flooded the room. "Police, don't move," a voice shouted. Mark froze instantly while the syringe slipped from the doctor's hand and shattered on the concrete floor. Two officers rushed down the stairs while another stood at the doorway, pointing a flashlight directly at Mark. For several seconds, no one moved. The hiss of gas was the only sound in the room. One officer stepped forward and grabbed Mark's arms, pulling them behind his back. "You're under arrest," he said firmly. The doctor attempted to step backward toward the stairs, but another officer blocked his path immediately. "Stay where you are," the officer ordered. Mark looked around the basement in disbelief before turning his eyes toward me. "You called them?" he whispered. I shook my head slowly. "No," I replied. One of the officers tightened the cuffs around Mark's wrists. "Your entire conversation was recorded," he said calmly. The realization spread across Mark's face like a shadow. The phone under my pillow had done exactly what Daniel promised it would. As the officers escorted Mark toward the stairs, he twisted around to look at me one last time. "You think this is over?" he said quietly. "You have no idea what you've started." The officer pushed him forward without responding. Moments later, the basement fell silent again, except for the sound of another officer shutting off the gas valve near the water heater. I sat in the chair for several minutes while the adrenaline slowly faded from my body. The nightmare I had been living through for weeks was finally collapsing around the people who created it. But Mark's final words lingered in my mind. "You have no idea what you've started." Something about the way he said it suggested there was still one piece of the plan I hadn't discovered yet. I didn't have to wait long to learn what he meant, because the moment Mark left the house in handcuffs, someone else was already on her way to the airport. Karen. And the flashing lights from the police cars painted the front of the house in red and blue, while paramedics wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. I sat on the back step trying to steady my breathing, while officers moved through the house collecting evidence. Mark stood near the driveway beside a patrol car with his hands cuffed behind his back. He looked strangely calm, almost amused, like someone who had expected trouble but not defeat. When he noticed me watching, he smiled in a way that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't the smile of a man who had just been arrested for attempted murder. It was the smile of someone who believed the game wasn't finished yet. A detective approached me then, introducing himself as Detective Miller, the officer who had coordinated with Daniel once the recording started. He assured me that Mark and the doctor would face serious charges. I nodded slowly while trying to process everything that had happened in the last hour. Just as the officers began leading Mark toward the patrol car, he turned his head and spoke quietly in my direction. "You're celebrating too early," he said. I frowned slightly, unsure what he meant. "What are you talking about?" I asked. Mark gave a small laugh that sounded almost relaxed. "You think I was doing this alone?" Before I could answer, the officer guiding him toward the car tightened his grip. "Enough," the officer said. But Mark kept looking at me as he spoke his final words. "She already has it," he said calmly. My pulse jumped. "Who?" I asked. Mark's smile widened. "You know who," he replied. Then the officer pushed him into the back seat of the car and closed the door. The engine started and the cruiser pulled away slowly down the street, leaving me standing there with a terrible realization forming in my mind. Karen. I stood up immediately and walked back inside the house, ignoring the paramedics who tried to stop me. Detective Miller followed closely behind while I moved upstairs toward Mark's office. The bookshelf looked exactly the same as it had earlier that evening, but something about it felt wrong now. I reached for the book that had concealed the hidden phone and pulled it from the shelf. The hollow compartment inside was empty. My stomach dropped instantly. The phone was gone, but something else was missing too. My father's ledger. That book contained the account numbers, property records, and financial notes my father had kept for years. It was the closest thing to a map of his entire estate. "She took it," I whispered. Detective Miller frowned. "Who took it?" he asked. I looked up slowly. "Karen," I said. Saying her name out loud made the betrayal feel even heavier than it already had. Daniel arrived about 20 minutes later. When I told him the ledger was missing, his expression darkened immediately. "That book contains the keys to everything your father owned," he said quietly. Detective Miller rubbed his jaw while thinking through the implications. "If she has those records, she could move money quickly," he said. My stomach tightened as I listened. Karen hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. She had taken the one document that could unlock the entire structure of my father's wealth. "We'll alert the airports," the detective said. But Daniel shook his head slowly. "If she planned this with Mark for months, she's already gone," he replied. The room felt colder as I absorbed those words. "Where would she go?" I asked. Daniel looked at me carefully before answering. "Somewhere with financial systems that are harder to track." I already knew what he was about to say next. "The Cayman Islands," he finished quietly. 3 days later, the jail called and informed me that Mark wanted to speak with me. I didn't want to go at first. The thought of seeing him again made my stomach turn. But something inside me told me there were still answers I needed to hear. When I arrived at the detention center, a guard led me to a small room with a glass window separating 2 metal chairs. Mark was already sitting on the other side wearing an orange uniform. He looked thinner than he had a few days earlier, but the calm expression hadn't disappeared. "You look better," he said the moment I sat down. "I'm not drugged anymore." I ignored the comment and folded my arms. "Karen took my father's ledger," I said. Mark leaned back in his chair slowly. "Of course she did," he replied. I stared at him while waiting for the rest of the explanation. Mark's smile returned gradually. "You really thought she was just helping me?" he asked. "What are you talking about?" I asked quietly. Mark leaned forward and lowered his voice slightly. Karen was the one who realized what your father's estate was worth," he said. My pulse quickened. "I already know what it's worth," I replied. Mark chuckled softly. "No, Claire," he said. "You don't." I felt my stomach tighten as he continued speaking. "Your father wasn't worth $30 million, he said calmly. The number hung in the air for a moment before he finished the sentence. "He was worth nearly 10 times that." For a second, I just stared at him, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "300 million?" I asked. Mark nodded slowly. "International accounts, offshore investments, properties in multiple countries," he said, and every one of those details was inside the ledger Karen took. The weight of those words settled over the room like a storm cloud. Mark leaned back again, clearly enjoying the effect his explanation was having. Karen is probably sitting in a financial office somewhere in the Caribbean right now, he continued. And the moment she transfers those assets into the shell accounts we created, she disappears. I watched his face carefully while he spoke. He truly believed Karen had won. You sacrificed everything for nothing, he added quietly. I stood up slowly and walked toward the door. Mark frowned as he realized I wasn't responding the way he expected. That's it? He asked. You're just leaving? I paused with my hand on the door handle and looked back at him. For the first time since this nightmare began, I smiled. Mark, I said calmly, you really should have read that ledger more carefully. His expression changed instantly. What do you mean? He asked. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway before answering. Because the numbers in that book, I said, aren't what you think they are. 5 hours after I left the jail, Karen landed in the Cayman Islands carrying the ledger she believed would unlock a fortune. Security cameras later showed her walking confidently through a quiet financial district near the harbor before entering a private law office that specialized in offshore transactions. According to the reports investigators later shared with me, Karen sat across from a financial officer and placed the ledger on the desk with a satisfied smile. She pointed to the account numbers written on the first page and asked him to begin the transfer process immediately. The officer entered the numbers into the banking system and waited while the screen processed the request. Karen leaned back in the chair and crossed her legs, already imagining the new life she believed she had secured. But when the system finished processing, the screen turned red and displayed a message instead of a balance. Access denied. Karen frowned and asked the officer to try another account number from the ledger. The result was the same. Access denied. Her confidence began to fade as the officer attempted a third entry with identical results. Finally, Karen pointed to the master code written near the back of the book. Use that, she said sharply. The officer entered the code and pressed the confirmation key. For a moment, the screen processed normally before changing again. This time, a message appeared across the entire display in bold black letters. If you're reading this, you are not my daughter. Karen stared at the screen in disbelief while the officer tried to understand what the message meant. The text continued below the first line. These account numbers are not real accounts. They are a trigger. Anyone attempting to access them without authorization identifies themselves as a thief. Before Karen could respond, every computer in the office began chiming simultaneously. The system had automatically sent a detailed report to multiple financial authorities around the world. Every transfer, every shell company, and every illegal transaction connected to the accounts Karen and Mark had opened appeared in that report. Within minutes, the office doors opened and 2 Cayman Islands police officers entered alongside an Interpol investigator. Karen attempted to leave the room, but the officers stopped her before she reached the door. She was arrested there in the office where she believed her new life was about to begin. The ledger slipped from her hands and fell to the floor. The same book she thought would unlock my father's fortune had just exposed everything she and Mark had done. 3 weeks later, I returned to the lake house my father built decades earlier. The air smelled clean and the water moved gently against the dock the way it always had. Inside the house, I found the envelope my father had told me about years before. It was hidden behind the stones of the fireplace exactly where he said it would be. The letter inside explained everything. My father knew that money attracts the wrong kind of attention. He suspected that someone might try to manipulate me after he was gone. The ledger was never meant to reveal the location of his wealth. It was designed to reveal anyone greedy enough to try stealing it. When I finished reading the letter, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the sun set across the water. The tea tasted exactly the same as it always had, but this time there were no secrets hidden inside it. Only the quiet certainty that the truth had finally come to light. The first night I stayed alone at the lake house felt strangely peaceful after everything that had happened. For weeks, my life had been filled with tension, suspicion, and careful acting. Sitting on that quiet porch beside the water felt like stepping into a completely different world. The wind moved softly through the trees, and the lake reflected the last light of the evening sky. I held my cup of chamomile tea and thought about how ordinary that drink used to seem. For months, Mark had used that simple routine to slowly take control of my life. Now I finally understood how easily trust can be turned into a weapon when the wrong person holds it. I read my father's letter again while the sky darkened around me. The words were written in the same steady handwriting I remembered from childhood. He had always been a careful man, the kind of person who planned 3 steps ahead in every situation. In the letter, he explained that the ledger had been designed years earlier as a test. My father believed that wealth often revealed people's true intentions. He wanted a way to expose anyone who tried to manipulate his family after he was gone. The ledger contained account numbers that looked real, but actually triggered a reporting system the moment someone attempted to access them. If a thief tried to move the money, every financial authority connected to those systems would immediately receive a record of the attempt. It was a trap hidden in plain sight, disguised as an invitation to greed. Reading those words made me realize something important. My father had never expected me to use the ledger myself. He had left it behind to protect me from exactly the kind of betrayal Mark and Karen had planned. In a strange way, the same document they believed would make them rich had become the evidence that destroyed them. Over the next few weeks, the investigation unfolded quickly. Mark remained in custody while prosecutors reviewed the recordings from the night of his arrest. Every word he and the doctor had spoken in the basement was now part of the official case file. The evidence from his hidden phone confirmed months of planning with Karen, including the financial transfers and the arrangements with the specialist who was supposed to declare me mentally incompetent. The doctor who arrived that night faced charges as well, since the syringe he brought into my bedroom contained the same sedative that had been used repeatedly in my tea. Detective Miller told me the case was one of the clearest examples of financial manipulation he had seen in years. Mark had believed the plan was flawless because it relied on slowly reshaping the way people perceived me. Instead of confronting me directly, he tried to rewrite the story of who I was. Karen's situation became even more complicated once the international report from the ledger reached investigators. The system my father created had documented every transfer she attempted to make using the shell companies Mark opened months earlier. Those transactions connected directly to the money missing from my accounts. Within days, authorities in the Cayman Islands began working with investigators in the United States to build a full case against her. When Detective Miller called to update me on the situation, he explained that Karen had been completely shocked when the ledger triggered the reporting system. According to the officers who arrested her, she kept insisting the account numbers had to be real because Mark told her they were. Listening to that explanation made me realize something almost ironic. Karen had trusted Mark's plan just as completely as I once trusted him. A few days later, I received a message from Daniel asking if I wanted to hear the final financial analysis of my father's estate. I met him at a small cafe near the lake house where we could talk quietly without interruptions. Daniel placed a folder on the table and slid it toward me before speaking. "Your father was even more careful than I realized," he said. Inside the folder were documents showing how the foundation my father created had already taken control of most of his wealth long before he died. The businesses and properties he built were now funding programs for children's education and housing across several states. Seeing those records made something inside me settle peacefully. My father had never been interested in leaving behind a fortune for someone to fight over. What mattered to him was making sure his work continued helping people long after he was gone. In that moment, I understood that the true inheritance he left me wasn't money at all. Daniel leaned back in his chair after explaining the details and watched my reaction carefully. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. I thought about the past few weeks and everything that had been revealed. "Relieved," I said finally. Daniel nodded slowly. "Your father knew the kind of people wealth attracts," he replied. "The trap he built proved exactly who Mark and Karen really were." Hearing those words reminded me of something else my father had once told me when I was younger. He used to say that the most dangerous person isn't the thief who steals something openly. It's the thief who believes they're smarter than everyone else. Mark and Karen thought they had discovered a secret fortune hidden in that ledger. They never imagined the numbers inside it were designed to reveal them the moment they tried to claim it. A month later, I visited Mark one final time before the court hearings began. The guard led me into the same room where we had spoken before. Mark looked thinner than the last time I saw him, but his expression was still guarded. When I sat down across from the glass, he stared at me silently for a moment before speaking. Karen told me the accounts were fake, he said. I nodded slowly. They were never real, I replied. Mark shook his head as if trying to understand how everything had collapsed so quickly. $300 million, he said quietly. We thought we had everything. I studied his face while he spoke. For years, I had believed this man was my partner, someone who shared the same values and dreams. And now I could see how much of that belief had been built on assumptions rather than truth. You had something much more valuable than money, I said calmly. Mark looked up at me with a confused expression. What? He asked. I thought about the quiet porch at the lake house, the letter my father left behind, and the programs his foundation was already funding for families who needed help. You had a life built on trust, I said, and you traded it for a plan that destroyed you. Mark didn't respond right away. The silence between us lasted several seconds before he finally spoke again. Do you hate me? He asked. The question surprised me because I had expected anger or blame instead. I considered the answer carefully before replying. No, I said softly. Hating you would mean giving you more power over my life. The guard opened the door a moment later, signaling that our time was finished. I left the detention center that day without looking back. The past few months had shown me how easily trust can be manipulated by someone who sees relationships as opportunities instead of commitments. But they had also reminded me of something stronger. The truth has a way of surfacing no matter how carefully someone tries to bury it. Now, when I sit on the porch at the lake house with a cup of tea, the quiet feels different than it did before. It isn't just peaceful. It's honest. There are no hidden cameras, no whispered conversations about my sanity, and no plans unfolding behind my back. The only sound is the wind moving across the water and the certainty that the life I rebuild from here will belong entirely to me. A few weeks after my last visit to the detention center, the court hearings finally began. I sat quietly in the courtroom while the prosecutor presented the recordings from that night in the basement. Hearing Mark's voice echo through the speakers felt surreal. The calm way he explained the gas leak, the way he discussed my supposed mental collapse as if it were a medical certainty, and the casual tone he used while planning what would happen to me afterward left the entire room silent. The doctor who stood beside him that night had already pleaded guilty in exchange for cooperating with investigators, which meant he confirmed every detail of the plan Mark and Karen created together. Watching the jury listen to those recordings made me realize how much of my life had been hidden behind a performance. For weeks, Mark had acted like a concerned husband, but the evidence revealed a completely different man. By the time the trial ended, the outcome was inevitable. Mark was convicted on multiple charges related to fraud and attempted murder. Karen's case moved through the courts more slowly because of the international investigation, but the evidence against her was just as strong. The financial transfers she attempted to make from the Cayman Islands connected directly to the accounts Mark opened months earlier. Every email, every message, and every document recovered from the ledger trap confirmed the same story. She had helped Mark create the plan from the beginning. When the final charges were announced, the prosecutors explained that the reporting system hidden in the ledger had provided investigators with a complete record of every illegal transaction the moment she attempted to access the fake accounts. My father's precaution had exposed everything they tried to hide. By the time the proceedings ended, both of them faced years of consequences for what they had done. Life became quieter after the legal battles were finished. I spent most of my time at the lake house, gradually restoring the small details that made it feel like home again. The dock needed repairs. The porch swing had weathered over the years, and the old fishing boat required more work than I expected. But those projects felt grounding in a way I hadn't experienced for months. Each morning, I walked down to the edge of the lake and watched the water ripple across the surface while the sun rose over the trees. It reminded me of mornings I spent there with my father when I was younger. He used to wake me before sunrise and tell me that the quietest hours of the day were the most honest ones. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. Now I did. Daniel visited occasionally to check on me and to make sure the last pieces of the investigation were finally closed. During one of those visits, we sat on the porch watching the sky change colors as evening settled across the lake. Your father would be proud of how you handled everything, Daniel said quietly. I thought about that for a moment before answering. He prepared me better than I realized, I said. Daniel nodded slowly and looked out toward the water. He didn't just leave you protection, he said. He left you clarity. That word stayed with me long after Daniel drove away that night. Clarity. My father understood something that Mark and Karen never did. Wealth can attract people who see opportunity where trust should exist. But character reveals itself the moment someone believes they've found an easy way to take what belongs to someone else. The foundation my father created continued expanding its programs while I slowly stepped into a role helping oversee the work he started. Visiting the schools and community centers the foundation supported showed me exactly why he made the decision he did before he died. The money Mark and Karen believed they were stealing had already been transformed into something far more meaningful. It was funding scholarships, housing programs, and health clinics in communities that needed them. Standing in those places and seeing the difference it made reminded me that my father's real legacy had nothing to do with bank accounts or property titles. It was about the people whose lives were changing because of what he built. Occasionally, someone asks if I ever think about the life Mark and Karen believed they were going to live after the plan succeeded. The beach houses, the private accounts, and the freedom they imagined waiting for them on the other side of my disappearance. The truth is, I don't think about it very often anymore. The anger that once lived inside me faded slowly once everything was finally resolved. What remains instead is a quiet understanding of how easily trust can be misused when someone values money more than the person standing beside them. I've learned that betrayal doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it appears as kindness, concern, or careful attention to your well-being. These days, my evenings are simple. I make tea in the kitchen the same way Mark used to, but the ritual feels completely different now. I sit on the porch with the cup warming my hands while the lake reflects the fading light of the day. The air carries the scent of pine and water, and the world feels steady again. There are no hidden cameras in the ceiling, no whispers about my sanity, and no one watching to see whether I finish the tea. The quiet has become something I appreciate in a way I never did before. If there is one thing this experience taught me, it's that instincts matter more than we often realize. When something feels wrong, it usually is. For weeks, I ignored that feeling because I trusted the person standing closest to me. Trust is powerful, but it should never replace the voice inside your mind that tells you when the pieces of a story no longer fit together. The moment I began listening to that voice was the moment everything started to change. Now, when the sun disappears behind the trees and the last light fades across the lake, I sit there for a few minutes longer than I used to. I watch the water settle into darkness and think about how my life once felt like it was slipping quietly out of my hands. Then I take a slow sip of tea and remind myself that the truth has a way of returning everything to its proper place. Mark and Karen believed they had discovered the key to my father's fortune. What they actually discovered was the proof of who they truly were. And that realization gave me something much more valuable than the money they were chasing. It gave me my life back. At what moment in this story did you realize Mark couldn't be trusted anymore? Tell me in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Mind Tales by Keomi for more unforgettable stories.